this is Chapter 5, Cost Accounting. So if you would take your handout on Chapter 5 and turn to problem 22, I'm going to step through how to do it. Chapter 5 is very similar to Chapter 4. This is all about overhead allocation, and whenever we're dealing with allocation of anything, we're talking about ratios. So let's talk about these. I've kind of copied these for Excel. I may jump over to the solution in just a little bit, but anyway, Excel is a great place to do allocation of anything. So we have two styles of trophies, basic and deluxe, and we operate at capacity. Operating at capacity is important because basically we can't sell anymore without increasing our fixed costs. That's what it basically means there. They do large custom orders. They budget to produce 10,000 basic trophies and 5,000 deluxe trophies. Those are a couple items that you might want to circle or make some notes on. So basically, remember, we're at capacity. So I have basic and I have deluxe. And I would like to keep track of the 10,000 and the 5,000. I always write things down separately so I don't lose track of them. So we are at capacity. You can circle that, write that down. Manufacturing takes place in two production departments, forming and assembly. In the forming department, indirect manufacturing costs are accumulated into two cost pools, setup and general overhead. So when I'm talking about overhead, I'm going to pause this a second. So I moved it over here. So manufacturing takes place in two production departments, forming and assembly. So I have two production departments. And forming department, indirect manufacturing costs are accumulated in two cost pools, setup and general. So setup and general. So in other words, when we take our estimated manufacturing overhead divided by our estimated base, or you could use actual manufacturing overhead divided by actual base. We just use estimated a lot, so I say that, but it could be actual instead of estimated. But we're going to have two fractions, one for setup and one for general, whereas the assembly department, all manufacturing overhead costs are accumulated in one overhead cost pool. So the assembly department's just going to have one fraction of overhead divided by your base. The basic trophies are formed in batches of 200. So my basic is batches of 200. So that's important in case we have some batch costs, so you can see how many batches I have. So 10,000 divided by 200 in a batch is going to give you 50 batches. Okay, so I don't know if I'll use that, but I might need it. Because of the more intricate detail, the deluxe trophy are formed in batches of 50. So in this case, I have batches of 50. And so I'm going to have 5,000 divided by 50. So I'm going to have 100 batches there. So that might help me out later. The controllers asked you to compare plant-wide, department, and activity-based costing allocation. So notice that we have two types of trophies, basic, and again, I may just flip back to the solution just a second here, but deluxe. Okay, in most of the problems you have three types of costs. You're going to have direct material, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead. Okay, in this case, these things are actually moving through two departments. So they're going to accumulate direct materials, direct labor, and overhead. In fact, two overheads. So in the forming department, and then they're going to move through the assembly department and incur two different, or one overhead. So direct material, direct labor, and overhead. So I'm actually going to cut these and move them down because I'm going to have direct materials for the forming, and I'm going to have direct materials. I'm going to have direct materials for the assembly. I'm going to have direct labor for the forming. I'm going to have direct labor for the assembly. And I'm going to have manufacturing overhead for the forming based on setups. And I'm going to have manufacturing overhead for the forming based on general. And then I'm going to have manufacturing overhead for assembly. Okay, so If I did it again, I may actually have two columns that they accumulate the cost, or I might put all the forming together and all the assembly together, which your solution may or may not. I haven't looked at it yet. Okay, so right now I know that the direct materials in the forming department for the basic are 60,000, and direct labor for the forming department is 30,000. Again, you can set this up however in the heck you want. I don't know how much setup overhead it gets yet, but I do know that the deluxe has direct materials of 35,000, and they have 20,000 of direct labor. Okay, and then they have overhead, and I need to these overhead costs are 48 plus 32, so I need to allocate these between the two. Because they both incur setup costs and they both incur general overhead costs. So if I have a total out here, I know that in the forming department I have labor or materials of 95,000. I have $50,000 of labor, and I know that my manufacturing overhead is going to add up to 48,000 for setup, and it's going to add up to 32,000 for assembly. I just don't know how to split it up. So again, I probably should have kept them in the same order there, but hopefully you're following this. Then I'll show you the solution. Okay, then I can go to the assembly department, and I'm getting 5,000 of direct materials and 10,000 for the deluxe. Okay, and then for direct labor, I'm getting 15,000, and I'm getting 25,000. Okay. So now that you can see I have my costs. So far what I've done is simply it's a little bigger. I've simply listed the costs, and I know it's direct materials, direct labor, and just a second, I have 40,000 to split. So I know that I'm going to can't get to my auto sum. I know that I'm going to have to total up to $320,000 worth of total costs in this particular problem. It's just that I need to allocate them. So I can allocate these costs however I want. I could allocate them 50-50, etc., etc. I just simply need to fill in the blanks. So the first problem says calculate the budgeted unit costs of direct and deluxe trophies. So this one's unit cost. So I know that I'm going to have a total here. I'm just going to copy that. Okay. So now I know I'm going to have a total there. And then I'm going to divide by the number of trophies because it wants the cost per trophy. And I believe I set up here 10,000 and 5,000. So here's my number of trophies. And again, you can do this. I could type right. Okay, so required, whoops, I copied it twice. Calculate the budgeted unit cost of basic and deluxe trophies based on a single plant-wide overhead rate. Single means I just use one instead of like it's set up here. So they're telling us to ignore the cost pools. So I want estimated overhead. So my fraction is going to be my estimated overhead divided by my estimated base. I'll just do that down here, or actually this is budgeted, so it is estimated. So I have estimated manufacturing overhead. I'm going to divide that by my estimated base. Okay, I don't know what my base is yet, but I do know that my overhead is 48, 32, and 40. So I've got a total of $120,000 worth of overhead. And it says if total overhead is allocated based on total direct labor cost. Okay, so I want my total direct labor cost, and if I have that set up pretty good here, I know my total direct labor costs. Would explain my issue. I can't read. If total overhead is allocated based on total direct costs. Okay. Don't forget to include, etc. Okay, so I need total direct costs, not direct labor costs. So notice I have direct labor costs of 90,000, but I want direct costs, so I'm going to allocate it based on that. Again, you can allocate things however in the heck you want to. They have just told us to use one, and they're going to allocate it based on direct costs, under the idea that the more materials and labor you have in something, the more overhead it should get. So that honestly should make sense. So I have my estimated manufacturing overhead divided by my estimated base, and I'm going to get 60 cents per direct cost. Okay, so I need to just then put it here, and I'm going to, in this particular problem, I'll put plant-wide here, and I'll delete this line later, but basically these are non-existent, so I'm going to cover those up in black. Okay, so those don't necessarily exist, but hopefully this line will add up to 48, 32, and 40. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I have direct costs of, all those are my direct costs, okay? And so my direct costs, I'm going to take that times 60 cents, but I have to put some parentheses in here so it won't take it times the D17 only. So I have that times, let's click on that cell, that rate. So I have 66,000 is my direct costs, okay? Hopefully that adds it up in there, D21, yeah. Okay, so when I add these across in the end, remember this $320,000 there? It's actually the sum of all those, and notice that I'm adding those across. Hopefully it's going to end up to $320,000 when I'm done. Okay, so now I'm going to allocate to the deluxe based on my direct costs. So they have these 4 direct costs, and again I need to make sure I do my math right. So I'm going to take it times 60 cents. And that just means I don't have the cell wide enough. 144,000. So voila. Notice this is 320,000, etc. So my cost per unit, oops, I'll do it here. I'll just put a big thick border around it. So I want to take my $176,000 worth of cost divided by my 10,000 units, and I have $17.60. Okay, then I'm going to do the same thing over here, so I'll just copy and paste the thing, and so I have $28.80. All right, so if you would go ahead and, let's see, let me pause it. This is the solution on your handout. You can see there they get the 60 cents. They have the direct materials, the direct labor. They simply added the two together, the two departments together. And then they allocated and got 66 and 54. And they also got the 1760 and the 2880. So you can look at theirs, or you can kind of play with it on your own. Again, it's not that difficult. So I'm going to go back to the other one. Okay. So in this one, now we're going to calculate the budgeted unit costs of basics and deluxe trophies based on departmental overhead rates, where the forming department overhead are allocated based on total direct manufacturing labor costs. So I got to read this carefully. Where the forming department overhead costs are allocated based on direct manufacturing labor costs, and the forming department and assembly department overhead costs are allocated on total direct manufacturing labor costs of the assembly department. Okay, so again, sometimes these things are just reading it carefully to figure out what the allocation is. So let me go back up here. So move that. So I'm on this one right here. So I know I need to delete this because we're no longer doing the plant-wide. And I know that I can simply use this, but I'm going to have more than one. Okay? Now let's read it again slowly so I don't do my overhead allocation wrong. Where the forming department overhead costs are allocated based on direct manufacturing labor costs of the forming department. So we're going to do that first. Where forming department overhead costs are allocated based on direct manufacturing labor costs of the forming department. and assembly department overhead costs are allocated based on total direct manufacturing labor costs of the assembly department. Okay, so it looks like we're not going to split up these two overhead items here. So let's just have no fill there. Okay, so it looks like I'm not going to split up the 48 and 32 until maybe we get to C. So in the forming department, I'm going to have its overhead, 48 and 32, divided by its estimated base, and its estimated base, again, direct manufacturing labor costs of the forming department. So I need direct manufacturing labor costs of the forming department. So again, probably it'd be a better idea if you kind of got your headings kind of better than mine, but direct labor forming, okay, and so that one is for the basic, and that one is for, that looks like I got my cell wrong there, okay, so 30 plus 20, okay, so I got 50,000. I guess I could have just done that because that is all forming department, so I could have just done that 50,000 there, but anyway, so it's $1.60 per forming department direct labor costs, okay? So instead of having two of these, I'm just going to stick it up here. So I'm going to have 48,000 plus 32,000, and then I'm going to delete this one, okay? So now I'm going to allocate that. So I want this direct labor of the forming times my 736. Oh. Okay. Let me pause that to get my correct numbers in there because I deleted some things. All right, I typed in 320,000 up there. So now I have the right number, which is the 48,000 plus the 32,000 is 80,000. Okay. So I simply take the direct labor of the forming department, go here, I simply take that times my $1.60, okay? And then I'm going to go here in the deluxe, and I'm going to simply take the direct labor of the forming department for the deluxe times my $1.60. And notice that I've got 48,000 and 32,000. Now this one says in the assembly department overhead costs, so I'm going to do the same thing for assembly, and let's copy it down there, then fill in the right numbers. Okay, so my assembly department overhead costs are 40,000, and I'm going to divide it by total direct manufacturing labor costs of the assembly department. So my assembly direct labor costs are 15 plus 25, or the 40,000 total there. So I'm going to have it as $1 per direct cost. So now I'm going to go down here, and I have my 15,000 times my $1, and I'm going to have my 25,000 times my $1. Okay. So if some of you looked at that and say, well, why don't I just simply do 15/40ths times the 40,000, you're going to get the same number, except sometimes you develop your overhead allocation based on a year, and then they ask you for a month. Okay, and so your numbers won't be ratio of the same. This one is simply giving us the year numbers and asking us for the allocation based on the year. So you could just do overall of, I have 15 divided by 40 times the total amount I want to allocate, which is 40,000, and I get the 15,000 there. And then I have 25 divided by 40 times the amount I want to allocate, 40, and I get 25. So notice 15 and 25. That's fine if you're going to allocate the entire overhead cost, but basically you can never go wrong if you get it per direct, get your allocation of $1.60 per direct, because then they may say, okay, this is what we did for this week, how much overhead was allocated, and you have to do $1.60 times the direct labor cost for that week. Okay, so that's the second one. Notice that then I divide it by my 10,000 units, and I get 17.3 and 29.4. if I go back to the solution, you can see they get the $1.60 allocation, the dollar, and they end up with the 17.3 and 29.4. Okay. In number 3, we're going to go to, let's read it. Calculate the budgeted unit cost of basic and deluxe trophies if they allocate overhead in each department using activity-based costing, where setup costs are allocated based on the number of batches. Okay, so now I'm going to have 3. So let me stop this and fix my numbers here, because I'm going to get rid of these. And I need to change this back to 48,000 and 32,000. Okay, so now I've got so where setup costs are allocated based on the number of batches. Okay, so let's do, this is forming setup here. And let's actually do it before we forget. So my allocation of overhead, this is setup, 48,000. Okay, I'm going to allocate it based on number of batches. So my total number of batches are 50 batches here and 100. So I have a total of 150 batches. So it's going to get $320 per batch. So my basic is going to get 50 times the 320. So my basic is going to be allocated 16,000. And my deluxe has 100 batches times the 320. So my deluxe is 32,000. So if you want to check your math, that better add up to 48,000. And it does, so I'm good. Okay? Don't just divide it by 50 or divide it by 100, because this is your forming cost for both of the trophies. So I'm basically splitting it between both of the trophies. Some of you might look at this and say, okay, well, 1/3 of the batches are done in the basic, 2/3 of the batches are done by the deluxe, so 1/3, 2/3. It's going to get the same thing. But you just do it how you want. Whichever way means more to you. Okay, so then let's go to the next one. And general overhead costs for each department are allocated based on the direct manufacturing labor costs of each department. Okay, so now I have the forming. I have general here of 32,000. I'm going to allocate that 32,000 based on the direct manufacturing labor of each department. So, got to find that. I'm in the forming department, direct labor, and that is 50,000. So it's going to be 64 cents per direct manufacturing labor. So I have forming labor times the 64 cents, and I have deluxe labor times the 64 cents. So if you notice, this can be kind of error prone if you pick up the wrong numbers. So don't forget to double check and make sure things add up. Oops. I want to make sure that that plus that equals the 32,000. Okay. Doesn't mean you're going to be right, but didn't pick up the right numbers. But sometimes if you click on the wrong cell, you can see because they won't add up. And then I've got assembly, and it says my assembly costs are 40,000, so that's my numerator, and my base is assembly are allocated based on the direct manufacturing labor cost. So I want assembly direct labor, and that's 40,000. So I'm going to do, it looks like it's $1 again, divided by 40,000. So that is $1 per direct labor cost. So I have just direct labor assembly times the 1. And then I have the direct labor assembly times the allocation of 1. And now you can see that it ends up as 1602 and 3196. And we'll go back over to the other solution, and you can see they kind of do the same thing we did, 1602, 3196. Question 4 asks for briefly explain why the plant-wide department and activity-based costing system show different costs. Which system would you recommend and why? And hopefully you picked up on the fact that it was due to the batches, but let's kind of take a look at what they say. The cost of the basic trophies decreases. Why? Simply because they could be made in bigger batches. They use the deluxe trophies, uses a higher proportion of cost drivers, batches of setups, direct manufacturing labor costs than basic trophies, whereas the direct costs are slightly smaller for the deluxe trophies compared to the base trophies. This results in the deluxe trophies being undercosted and the basic trophies being overcosted. So you can kind of look through that. Activity-based costing, you would not use it if these came up to very, very similar. So let's compare them. We have 1602 and 3196. But if you go back to the very first one, it was 17 compared to 28. Okay, so is that worth it? We had 16. The other one was in the activity-based costing. This one was 16.02. And this one was, just so you can compare them, 31.96. Okay? All right. So the question is it worth it? I don't know why that went over there. Just going to go there. Guess it's just going to go there. Okay. So this is 28.80 versus 31.96. If you're selling these for $40 and you're selling these for $25, you know, maybe the time it took you to do this additional thing, and if you're going to do it routinely, maybe it's not worth it. However, if you do have to sell them for smaller margins, and I'm just selling these for $30, and I'm selling these for $20, I may be pushing the wrong product. I may be thinking I'm making more money on deluxe than basic. Again, you really only want to use this if the information you gain from it is beneficial and it's worth more than it costs you to get it. So that is just activity-based costing. And we're done.